For fish, it's a highway to ancient spawning grounds. For migrating birds, its green ribbon of trees offers shelter and food. We, too, depend on the Farmington River and the valley that it shaped. Our own highways run alongside it. For thousands of years, people have lived in its broad, fertile lowlands and fished from the rocks in its rapids. People harnessed the river's power to run factories. Before there were roads, the river was our road. And we can still journey on that road. It will show us something vital, something that our river must have. It's the forest, holding the soil, absorbing the rain, shading the water, feeding the insects. Forested land is the river's partner, keeping it clean, cool, and full of life. Once it was nearly destroyed by pollution and dams. Now the Farmington River is home once again to fish and fishing and to the otters, bears, eagles, and other wild animals that have returned. Everywhere it's a meeting ground for the old and the new, the wild landscape and the human world. Where railroads once rolled along the river, now people drift on the current, enjoying all that this natural treasure offers. We are so close to this river. It's a part of our history. It's part of our daily lives. And for more than 60 years, we have been bringing it back to life. That job isn't finished. There is still much to do. But we know how to do it. If we want the river to run silver again with thousands of fish from the sea, if we want it to run as clean and clear in our towns as it does in the forest, if we want it to sustain our communities and our spirits, we know what to do. We can be stewards of this treasure. Those who value the river most can help build the bridge to its future.
Good evening, and welcome to the annual meeting of the Farmington River Watershed Association, and to the first, and hopefully the last, virtual meeting of the association. My name is Michael Feldman, and I'm proud to serve as president of the association for the past year. Tonight, we are joined by two special guest speakers, Senator Christopher Murphy and Dr. David Leslie, an archaeologist with the University of Connecticut. After these speakers, we will have a brief business portion of the meeting presented by other association officers. The Farmington River is a beautiful and precious natural resource. It helps define our community and enhances our quality of life. We hope to share with you our enthusiasm and affection for this wonderful river. As you can see, I'm standing alongside the river, just downstream from the Tarryville Gorge. You probably realize by now that this is not a live presentation, but that I'm being pre-recorded. After all, it's daytime where I am and nighttime where you are. Many of you are aware that the Farmington River is a federally designated wild and scenic river. You can see why. And here are some other reasons. The river provides habitat for an abundance of fish, birds, and other wildlife. It provides fresh and clean water to 500,000 people, 1 in 7 Connecticut residents. A few yards upstream from where I am standing at the Tarryville Gorge is a destination for whitewater paddlers and has been home to the Triple Crown Kayak Championship. The river is a favorite spot to fish for trout, pike, carp, and bass. It enhances the many hiking and biking trails that run along and over the river. And to many, it is simply a source of beauty and serenity, a refuge from our hectic lives, from stressful news, and from a frightful pandemic. The upper portion of the river was declared wild and scenic back in 1994, when it was one of only 2 rivers east of the Mississippi with that designation. In 2017, the lower river was also designated by Congress only after significant advocacy by our organization and by the efforts of Senator Chris Murphy, who has been a champion of the river and other conservation causes. Senator Murphy has been a U.S. Senator representing Connecticut since 2013. We thank him for his support and welcome him to our meeting tonight. Senator Murphy.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Listen, I am really glad to be with all of my friends at the Farmington River Watershed Association for your annual meeting. I'm sorry that it has to be done this way, but we have a lot to celebrate. Thank you to everybody who has been part of this long effort to get both the upper and the lower portions of the Farmington River and Salmon Brook designated as a wild and scenic river. This was a long process, and I'm glad that our work, at least with respect to the designation, is finally done. Well, now we have to build on that designation and try to bring down federal funds, try to use this designation in order to draw people to the river. It's a real asset for our state and for our region. We're going to have a lot of work ahead of us in 2021, depending on how this election works out. We're going to either be continuing to play defense on damage to our natural resources, or finally in a position after 4 years to try to reverse some of the damage that's been done. It's been so great to have partners in Connecticut who have been willing to teach me about the benefit of protecting our natural spaces, the benefit of doing the hard work to make sure that we have clean water. You know, we've been able to, I think, triple or quadruple the amount of money over the past 6 to 7 years that go into the Long Island Sound Cleanup Fund. And while it's named the Long Island Sound Cleanup Fund, you know how that money is used. It is often used upstream to try to do water quality improvement projects to make sure that the water that's ending up in the sound is as clean as possible. So we have these victories to celebrate: the designation of the Farmington River, the massive increase in money that we have available to us in Connecticut to protect the water that ends up in the sound, and we will achieve more victories in the future, especially if this election goes well, but we'll do it all together. So thanks so much for everything that you all do, and I'll kick it back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Senator Murphy, for joining us and for your efforts on behalf of the river. The FRWA's mission is to preserve and to protect the river and its watershed, because after all, the river cannot protect itself. And here are some of the ways we do this. By monitoring and testing the water quality under the expert guidance of Elisa Phillips-Griggs, our water quality and project coordinator. By participating in the removal of obsolete dams that impede the natural flow of the river. By providing educational events to schools and communities under the guidance of Amy Petrus, our outreach and education coordinator. By installing rain gardens and promoting activities to prevent pollution, and by arranging for river cleanups. By providing canoe and other recreational events for people to enjoy the river's natural beauty. So most of what we do is focused on the natural features of the river. But we're also interested in the story of the watershed as a habitat for people as well as for wildlife. Most of us are aware of the new bridge near Fisher Meadow in Avon. You may remember several years ago when they started excavating for that bridge, and they unearthed a unique ancient Paleo-Indian settlement that was 12,500 years old. We have invited Dr. Leslie, one of the archaeologists who studied that site, to speak to us tonight. Dr. Leslie is a senior archaeologist with the Archaeological and Historical Services located in Storrs and is affiliated with the Anthropology Department at the University of Connecticut, where he received his PhD. He has numerous research interests and publications to his name. It is intriguing to think of this river as being the home to people, to cultures, and to a civilization that long preceded us, whose lives were nurtured by the Farmington River, and who in turn nurtured this river. The same river we paddle on and play on, the same river that we hike by and whose visual beauty we enjoy, the same river which enhances the quality of life in the Farmington Valley, and that is a stone's throw from where many of us live. That same river sustained a civilization, sustained a people that made their home along the Farmington River thousands of years ago. So let me dedicate this meeting to those people who came before us, who were the first to use and the first to protect the river that today we are solemnly charged with protecting. And now I welcome Dr. Leslie.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation about what I believe is a very important archaeological discovery that happened here along the Farmington River a few years ago. Before we talk a little bit about the Brian Jones site and its place along the Farmington River here in Avon, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the archaeological past here in New England and the ways that archaeologists break up these different time periods, just so we all have a little bit of focus here for this discussion. So we generally use a range of different types of artifacts that are discovered at sites to break things into different time periods, or we can radiocarbon date some of these sites as well. In general, we break periods into before or after European contact here about 500 years ago, the woodland period, and you can see some of these types of artifacts here on the right that define the woodland period, the archaic periods, and then the Paleo-Indian period. And I'll be speaking today about the Paleo-Indian period here in Connecticut. A little bit more about terms and time. So geologists and archaeologists break up the Pleistocene, or the sort of ice ages that some of you are familiar with when the glaciers were here, as this period of time from 1.8 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, or 10,000 years before present. A period of relatively stable, cold and dry, although there were warming periods throughout the Pleistocene as well. We are living through the Holocene, so that's 10,000 years ago to present, which is the most recent geologic period, and sometimes thought of as an interglacial period that's really sort of continuing the Pleistocene. The Holocene can then be broken up into the early Holocene, in which it was cool and wet, the middle Holocene when it's warm and dry, and the late Holocene, in which we sort of have relatively modern conditions that we have today as well. So if we think about these sort of broad archaeological periods in North America, with a particular focus here in the Northeast, we can look at sort of environmental reconstructions of what the landscape would have looked like during these periods. So Paleo-Indians are those earliest occupants of North and South America and the period of their occupation, which is associated with the end of the Pleistocene, or about 13,000 to 10,000 years ago. And you can see here that the glaciers were quite close, at least during part of this, about 13,000 years ago, to where we are here in southern New England. And it was sort of a taiga, tundra environment for some of this time period. The types of technology or artifacts that archaeologists find are these sort of spear points here that we think of as sort of large spears, or also atlatl darts. So darts like this that you can see attached here as I move the cursor to what's called a spear thrower, or an atlatl, that acts as an extra fulcrum to propel the dart at prey, like you see in the sort of cartoon representation of hunting a mastodon here. Also woodworking tools, so spoke shaves like this piece of flint here, or chert, end scrapers for processing hides for clothing or tent material, and sort of a range of other types of artifacts, such as these here that we'll see were discovered at the Brian Jones site here in Avon that I'll talk about in a little bit. Paleo-Indian peoples were highly mobile hunters and gatherers, or foragers, so they lived off the land. They did not cultivate crops through horticulture or agriculture. Instead, what they probably did was follow migratory large animal herds, such as mastodons, mammoths, caribou, muskox, and bison, although it's up in the air how migratory some of these herds might have been. Here in southern New England, there might have been sort of stable herds as well. They also would have eaten different seasonally available plants, tubers, berries, and nuts as they could find them. And they would have sort of organized their lifestyles around when the best time to capture these wetland plants, as well as hunt these large animals too. So it's not simply about sort of the big game hunting. It's also about making sure that you're in the right area when you can get cattails or berries. Probably they were wintering in southern New England and summering in northern New England, although it's difficult to get to that level of seasonality within the archaeological record. The raw material sources, so the types of artifacts that I showed you in the last slide, provide some clues as to how far afield these people were moving within one season. We'll talk a little bit about that with this site. The Brian Jones site has quite a bit of information to tell with that regard. But in some cases, we know that people were moving quite far distances, as much as 600 kilometers in 1 year. As we move forward to the Archaic period, again, we won't be talking about this today, but just to give you a little bit of a grounding in these sort of broad archaeological time periods, the way that archaeologists reconstruct them anyway. Here we see continuing to depend upon hunting and gathering, but a much broader base of resources. And you can see that while we don't have a modern environment during this time period, it's much cooler and sometimes wetter, sometimes drier during this portion of the Holocene. We are getting to a more temperate environment in our region. The technology that we see, it's a dramatically long period, 7,000 years. So as you could imagine, there are many new types of technology that are invented throughout this, through the early, middle, and late Archaic periods and terminal Archaic, coinciding with a dramatic shift in lifeways. New types of projectile technologies. Here we see some early Archaic projectile points, some middle Archaic points here, and then some late Archaic points over here as well. We see atlatl weights, which you can see here. So using weights on those spear throwers to project the spears harder and faster and possibly more accurately, because you're adding a bit of a weight to the fulcrum as well. But also we see dramatic development of ornate styles that preserve in the archaeological record. It's not as if Paleo-Indians didn't have artistic things that they created. In fact, we might have some of that evidence here at the Brian Jones site as well, but we don't see a lot of it preserved in the archaeological record. Gorgets, again, sort of personal wealth, groundstone tools, so tools that are pecked and ground and not simply flaked, such as these axes that you see here, to process new food resources as well. So think of the nut mast from acorns. They're grinding a lot of those. And also soapstone or steatite pottery is invented during the late Archaic. As I said, this is a period where you have a broad spectrum of resources that are being exploited, and so people are less mobile than in the Paleo-Indian period. Deciduous temperate forests develop. With these, like I mentioned before, you have large fall nut mass, as we can see outside your windows maybe today. We start to see anadromous or ocean-running fish spawning in the spring. That, of course, was happening in the Paleo-Indian period, but maybe happening a bit offshore because of the sea level rise associated with the glaciers. Summer berries and wetland plants. Maritime resources a big focus as well. Again, sort of more of the same with the Paleo-Indians, except for that we have a more temperate environment here. This allows people to spend more time in the same location. And as I said, people see the need for using permanent vessels such as soapstone pottery during the late Archaic period. As we move forward to the woodland period, again, not something that we'll spend any time at all on today, just again to give you a bit of a grounding. This is the first period where we see marked food production, agriculture, or horticulture, generally large villages near the coast, and it's between about 3,000 to 500 years ago, right before widespread European contact. And the environment of the region is what it is today for the most part. The technology reflects an increasing reliance on horticulture, farming, and these groundstone tools. So woodworking for canoes, for grinding corn, into sort of flour to make breads. New projectile points that you can see here, possibly the introduction of the bow and arrow, but also clay pottery becomes ubiquitous and is found at most woodland period sites. This is just as important as projectile points for helping archaeologists determine sort of when in time a site was occupied. As I said, people have these sort of year-round villages with small, sort of smaller encampments or villages near the coast. People are relying heavily on the three sisters, beans, maize, and squash, which provides a balanced diet, although they're, of course, supplementing this diet with other seasonally available plants and also hunting as well. And we see the development of the modern sort of political groups that exist today in the region during this time period, probably. So that's just sort of a brief introduction to the pre-colonial or the periods before widespread European contact of southern New England. As we move into a discussion about the Brian Jones Paleo-Indian site, this was discovered on the west bank of the Farmington River in Avon, Connecticut here. And you can see a view from the old Farms Road Bridge looking to the west. This is where the site was itself. It was named for the late state archaeologist Brian Jones, and I'll discuss why in just a minute. The site was found as part of a development project when the state, the Connecticut Department of Transportation, along with the town of Avon, was replacing and has already replaced the bridge, the Old Farms Road Bridge. We found artifacts about 1.5 meters or 5 feet below the original ground surface. You can see some of these initial artifacts that we pulled out in the first couple of days here, and you can see our crew excavating the initial excavations here and here. And then so, sort of to cut to the end, we discovered one of these very old, for southern New England, archaeological sites, a Paleo-Indian site. Ground penetrating radar was used at the site as a way to image the sort of stratigraphy or sediments underneath the site before we did the excavation. So if you look here to the right, the river is this way, but if you look in this ground penetrating radar map, the river is here to the left. When we did this, we found that there was a clear difference between sort of the Holocene or younger sediments, these brown ones here, and the Pleistocene or older sediments, these yellow sediments here. And you can see that I can see that here in the GPR, and I'll explain to you where it is. The archaeological site and Pleistocene sediments are here bounded in red. These are those yellow sediments, and the darker alluvium or river deposited, younger river deposited sediments are here in brown and this light gray. So what this means is that you can see this landform here. We have a levee or a river terrace that protected the site next to the Farmington River. This is another view of that in ground penetrating radar, but instead of looking at it in profile, we're looking at it from the top down. So this is looking at 50 centimeters below where our excavation started, and you can see the dark area here is actually the younger sediments, and this is actually the river terrace that the Paleo-Indians would have inhabited. So this is the edge of their sort of river terrace here in white. A little bit about the geology of the area. The site is situated, as I said, on this Pleistocene levee of the Farmington River. The Farmington River, as I'm sure many of you know, is a bit odd in that it flows north in this area. And this is due to a couple of reasons. One, there's the glacial moraine here in Farmington that causes the river as it's flowing south to move north. This is then bounded by the Talcott Ridge here. So it's flowing through these glacial Lake Farmington deposits until it can make it to the Talcott Notch. And this acts as a sort of nick point that controls the upriver downcutting. So while it looks like the Farmington River is meandering here, it probably did meander at some point 16, 15, 14,000 years ago. But we believe, based on the excavations here, that the Farmington River has been stuck in its current position north of the Farmington, north of the Talcott Notch for quite some time, probably 15 or 16,000 years. So the river has been stuck in this position, which has allowed the preservation of this archaeological site. This is a hypothesis that was developed out of Amber Lee Nicholan's master's thesis at the University of Connecticut. And so we sought to test this while we were doing the excavations. Here is a LiDAR map of the surface topography of the site prior to the bridge construction. And this is just another way of looking at that, a digital elevation map of this section of the river. This site is here. As I said, based on Amber Lee Nicholan's thesis and that Nick point, the river's ability to move large rocks within the riverbed is limited to the channel. It can't really move cobbles up and over the river terrace here. And that's important for a couple of reasons. But number one, from an archaeological perspective, it protected the site. So while in floods, sediments were deposited over top of the site, no large cobbles moved through here. So the river isn't eroding away the site itself. And also, it's not depositing any rocks or gravel on the site, which we'll come back to in a minute. But this creates a sort of lake effect or drape of fine-grained sediments over the site on the backside of this levee, which is a very low-energy environment. And this is something that archaeologists care a lot about, because now we know that the artifacts are almost all in place where they were dropped or deposited by people over 12,000 years ago. This flooding probably happens during the spring from ice melt like we see today. Probably also during this time period, there were large ice rock and dams that formed in the channel, causing periodic backups. So to test this, we did a series of soil cores with the geology program at the University of Connecticut here using a vibrocore method, which is simply using a concrete mixer that's attached to an electric generator that shakes the soil core, and we sort of push it into the ground and then vacuum extract sediment so that we can look at the site geologically and not just archaeologically. And this is a sort of reconstruction of what the sediments at the site look like based on initial interpretations of these soil cores that we collected. Here's a box sort of showing you where the site is and the modern position of the Farmington River. Bedrock is here in red. Here's a ground penetrating radar profile, and you can see that levee here as I move the cursor. So as we move from right or close to the river to left across the site, we have what we believe are reworked Pleistocene sediments closer to the river, so not in place, that lie underneath this sort of Holocene sediment. Sorry, as I go back, this is where they are in the GPR profile. You can see the colors match the cores. We have that Holocene or younger alluvium that's deposited after the site is occupied here, this dark brown sediment. And then we have sediments from the site itself. I should say that we don't have a radiocarbon date as I go back to the Holocene for these sediments, but Ken Fader and Fred Warner actually excavated a site in this general area in the Holocene sediments that is dated to about 3 to 2,000 years ago. So we have a good idea of how old these sediments are based on other archaeology that was actually done at the bridge site. The Pleistocene deposits of the site itself, you can see those sort of light yellow sediments that we saw earlier in the presentation. And then we have basal deposits here. And here's the only time that we really see any gravels at all in these soil cores, and that's here at the bottom. That probably shows, we don't have a radiocarbon date yet. We hope to get one soon. But that probably shows post-glacial Lake Farmington as the dam breaks for glacial Lake Farmington around 16,000 years ago. The river is probably a very wild, braided river that's cutting immediately into these silts and sands from glacial Lake Farmington with gravel sort of throughout. But then as the river gets stuck very quickly, we start to see the building of this levee with the sort of very light silts and sands and no gravels. And then finally, and very interestingly, behind the site, we have sediments that look like a developing wetland. So from a Paleo-Indian perspective, that's very important. That's a reason why you might want to be here, because some of those plants that I was talking about, water lily, cattail, they grow here in this wetland. And in fact, we found charred evidence of those in some of the hearths too. So we know that Paleo-Indians were using wetland species while they were here at the site. I mentioned that the site is named for Brian Jones. He is, of course, the late state archaeologist who passed away quite tragically last year after a battle with cancer. He, lucky for us, he was still a state archaeologist, and while he was fighting his cancer, he spent much of his time helping facilitate by providing us tents and his own expertise as well, excavating the site with us. He also, before he was state archaeologist, was involved in some of the initial cultural resource management work that predicted that the site would actually be here as well. So we were very lucky that he was able to help us out throughout the excavations and that he was there 15 years ago to predict the possibility that the site could have been here as well. Unfortunately, much of the site had to be excavated during the winter of 2019. That created logistical problems. We did most of it in propane heated tents that you can see here. But, you know, it created some logistical problems, but we were able to complete the excavations. Here is a map to the right of the excavations, but I'll also just start this GoPro video of a sped up every half a second pictures of us excavating. So here on the right, we have the archaeological features that were preserved in each of the 1 by 1 meter excavation units. We excavated over 200 meters and found 27 cultural features. So these circles here are possible hearths, so fireplaces, and possible posts down here for tents or maybe drying racks. I'll talk about those in a minute. These excavations finished in April of 2019. As I said, 27 cultural features. Here's a close-up of that map that I just showed you. This is what the hearths looked like. So they were quite striking with visible evidence of charcoal or the leftover pieces of the campfire preserved within them. Some of these were also posts that you can see here, situated around a possible hearth here. Here is a southern portion of the site that wasn't in that last drawing, where we can see a lot of these cobbles here within the surface of the site. And remember, the river isn't transporting these cobbles up and over. These are cobbles that people brought to the site, probably just locally from the channel. This is a fire-cracked rock on top of a hearth here. Another hearth is here. We have a couple of posts here and here. This is a rodent burrow, so rodents are getting into the site probably 12,000 years ago or so, disturbing the material. But we have good evidence here, we think, based on the artifacts that were recovered, many end scrapers, that this is probably an area where people were processing animal hides for winter clothing or maybe tent material too. Over 100 formal tools were recovered and over 15,000 total stone artifacts, not including the many tens of thousands of pieces of charred wood that we found in these features. So some of these tools, what do they look like? I mentioned that the raw materials provide some clues as to where people are coming from. Here at the top, we have a couple of piece iskes or wedges that Paleo-Indians would use to make bone tools or split wood. This is made out of local chalcedony, probably coming right out of the Talcott basalt ridge and sort of the pillow basalts. This is a local sort of siltstone hornfels material, maybe from north central Connecticut, maybe also in Avon as well. Other chalcedonies here. We have gravers. These are engraving tools, possibly for decorating bone implements or other purposes, maybe tattooing. It's difficult to know exactly what they're used for. These are all made on what's called Norman scale chert from the Hudson River Valley in New York. So quite a bit away, not too far, as we'll see from some other materials. Spoke shaves here. This curve was used to work wood as well. Also a piece of chert. We have end scrapers. This red artifact here is an end scraper made out of jasper from the Delaware Valley in Pennsylvania. It's been heated, that's why it's red and not yellow. We have rhyolites or volcanic artifacts, probably from northern New Hampshire. This is probably not this one here in the middle is probably a drill fragment. Um, and then quartz artifacts as well, made from locally available raw material. Side scrapers used to process hides as well. Uh, and then channel flakes. These are important for the production of the projectile points or the spears that people are making in the Paleo-Indian period. They're removing a single flake from the center of a projectile point that I'll show you a base in a minute as a simpler way to haft the spears. So these are quite diagnostic of the Paleo-Indian period. Most of these are made from that normal sculpture, although some are made from jasper or rhyolite from northern New Hampshire as well. Utilize flakes, so simply flakes that are used as sort of quick knives as a way to cut or scrape material. Projectile point preforms or bifaces. This is made from chert from the Hudson River Valley, also from the Hudson River Valley, and then these two here are from material collected from northern New Hampshire, but they're making them on site because they've broken a couple of them. So we know they were manufacturing these here. They brought the material from that far away as probably part of their seasonal migrations that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. And here we have some of the projectile point tips and bases. And here you can see this is the only fluted point base that we found, but it's got this central area here where that last flake or channel flake was detached to. So overall, what we would say is a pretty typical Paleo-Indian toolkit, revealing many specialized activities that are preserved at the site. We also know how long ago the site was occupied in at least one of the occupations from a radiocarbon date from a piece of charred pine here that you can see under scanning electron microscopy image here. This dates to 10,520 years ago. This is an uncalibrated radiocarbon date, which simply means that it's not a calendar date. Radiocarbon years are not equal to calendar years. You have to calibrate them to the calendar. This is from Feature 2, a large hearth in the northern portion of the site that you can see the excavations of here. When you calibrate this to the calendar, it's a date of 12,568 to 12,410 years ago. So let's say approximately 12,500 years ago, which makes the Brian Jones site in Avon the oldest well-dated site in southern New England. Here is a 3D reconstruction of that same feature, Feature 2. It's something that we do during many of our excavations, is make sure that we try to preserve as much of the site as possible digitally, as well as through the artifacts that we're excavating. And so this is a drone or ortho image of the completed 210 excavation meters here. The bridge abutments stand today here and here. So what do we know now? We're in the sort of preliminary stage of the analyses of this site, but I think that we do know a few things about why they chose this location repeatedly during the Paleo-Indian period. We know that we have several different occupations within the site. I didn't have as much time to talk about that today as maybe I should have, but we do have several occupations stacked on top of each other here. And so it seems that the Farmington River, as I'll discuss now and then in a little bit, is quite a draw for people, not simply during the Paleo-Indian period, through most, if not all, archaeological periods. It's a substantial river system, so it's quite attractive to people throughout the pre-colonial periods and the historical periods in Connecticut as well. This is because rivers provide important transportation routes along the rivers north and south. Not for nothing, you can follow the Farmington River watershed to the north into the Berkshires, and then you are relatively close to the Hudson River Valley, and you can get some of those important raw materials that we were talking about from the Hudson River Valley. You can also follow the Farmington River south and get to the Connecticut River, and then you can go throughout northern and southern New England. So this is a very important sort of area for travel within New England and into the West as well. Probably they are following or hunting
caribou, although we do have evidence for small game as well. We don't have any faunal remains that are preserved at the site except for a couple of pieces of calcined or burnt bone. The only piece that's identifiable is actually from a turtle, so it's clear that they were hunting small game, possibly fishing along the Farmington River as well. Here we see a reconstruction of what life might have been like at the site. They're also upstream of a small tributary system, so good fresh water right next to the site that's not coming from the Farmington River. Um, the site itself is on this sort of well-drained soils on the high crest uh, of a levee or a flood terrace. So even when it floods, the water probably drains out relatively quickly. And when it's not flooding, it's a good place to be. You're right next to the river. You can get north and south relatively easily. But also, it's a dry, good place for a camp spot too. And it's sort of intermediary between a lot of these areas, New York, Pennsylvania. We might not think of it as near Pennsylvania, but remember, with a lot of water locked up on ice on land, uh, the oceans were farther offshore, and you could get to Pennsylvania a bit more directly by traveling across Long Island Sound on foot. And then, of course, northern New Hampshire and possibly raw materials from northern Maine as well. So we have some ongoing work that we're doing with the site, obviously. Uh, this includes a number of specialized analyses of the material, um, a suite of radiocarbon dates to better understand the ages of all the occupations at the site, including geochemical analyses of the artifacts, but also of the soils themselves. One of the most important things about this site itself is not that the artifacts that we found, although those are of course very important, but it's the fact that it's here adjacent to a river. There are now in Connecticut two deeply buried Paleo-Indian sites adjacent to large river systems. Those are the only two in southern New England, and I think the only two in all of New England. And that's because we generally think of rivers during the Paleo-Indian period as quite unstable, and they generally are. But we have two now in Connecticut where the river was stable here in Avon and the Templeton site in northwestern Connecticut. And it's not as if the rivers in Connecticut are very different from those throughout the rest of New England. It's simply that there are mechanisms that provide for the stability of rivers, and I think that we're beginning to understand these geologically a little bit better. So that's something that's critically important about analyzing this site and looking for other Paleo-Indian sites. We're also going to do a host of other specialized analyses on the tools so we can try to fill out a little bit more about the daily life ways of people at this site, the types of foods they were eating through protein and residue analyses, the types of plants they were processing, phytolith and starch grains on these tools as well. But we're also trying to figure out, you know, I mentioned that the Farmington River is an important resource throughout the time periods here in Connecticut. That's true. But there seems to be a focus now that we can say uh, in the Paleo-Indian period. There is a regional focus for this area as critically important for Paleo-Indians. And we have 7 sites now that have been found along or near the Paleo-Indian River. We have the Brian Jones site here. We have the Lewis Walpole site here. This isolated projectile point site here. There's a couple of other isolated projectile points. Possibly another new site that was just discovered within the last year and a half here near Unionville in Avon. This large collaterally flaked biface that we are investigating currently as well. And also, as many of you may know, there's also the Pope Mastodon or the Farmington River Mastodon, although 2,000 years older than the Brian Jones site or any other known site in New England. That was this close as well here along the Farmington River. So this is starting to fill out a lot of our information about people during this remote period in southern New England history. There are only about 50 Paleo-Indian sites found or that are currently known in Connecticut, and we have 7 within a couple of miles of each other here. So one of the things that we're hoping with this research at this site is that we will begin to uncover better ways to predict where these sites are so that we can investigate them and learn more about this period, but also protect them as well. What does all this information tell us about what a day in the life might have been like for Paleo-Indians? Well, one of the things to remember is that well-excavated sites from this time period are incredibly rare. Not even only well-excavated sites, but also even individual find spots, like we discussed some of those along the Farmington River. Hopefully, the Brian Jones site will provide some of these data points for interpreting what daily activities or the goings-ons of people during this time period were like. One of the things that we think is that they're certainly doing hunting of large and medium-sized animals farther afield from the site. We don't believe that they would have been doing much hunting at a large social gathering place like this. Certainly they're doing it probably along the Farmington River system, as we discussed with some of those other isolated projectile point sites along the river. They might also be hunting or trapping smaller game, such as rabbits, beavers, reptiles as well, maybe also doing some fishing right here along the river or in other areas. Potentially, they would be gathering plant resources, again, from sort of a day's walk from within the site, but we think that there was a wetland sort of right behind the site, which would have been another attractor for why they were here. They would have been gathering plants such as cattail and water lily, which we have evidence for at the site, potentially also medicinal plants from wetlands as they're needed. Also think about the spring and summer when berries become available. Those would have been important resources for the nutrients and vitamins that they contain, as well as potentially nuts from deciduous trees, although those are in smaller amounts. In this time period, there are some of those here in southern New England. Also, we know that they were processing animal hides based on the number of end scrapers that we've found. So we know that they had many successful hunts. They're either processing animal hides from hunting events in the fall, probably, to prepare for winter for clothing or tent material, or reprocessing older hides that they had used throughout the winter to get a little bit more during the spring out of them. So potentially either of those things are happening at the site as well, based on the raw materials and the stone tools that we've found. We certainly also know that in one of the occupations, they were producing many projectile points. We didn't find any. They were able to create almost all of their projectile points in perfect form and use them and take them away. But clearly, they were gearing up for some sort of large hunting event, sort of a gear up site to prepare for hopefully one of those successful hunts that they could then process the animal remains. We also know, based on the distribution of stone tools at this site, that it was a pretty large gathering place in at least one of the occupations, because we have several hearths surrounded by stone tools that don't overlap with each other. So we think of those as sort of family areas. And because they don't overlap, we think that they were probably they were happening at the same time. So at least 5 different family groups at the Brian Jones site occupying the site at the same time. Again, the archaeological record from this time period is spotty, but these next sort of hypotheses are some ideas that we have based on other archaeological evidence of what might have been happening at this place. Again, multiple families, we think, from across the southern, northern New England region and into the Atlantics. That's based on the types of raw materials of stone tools that we find, again, segregated spatially at the site. So we have jasper from the Pennsylvania or Delaware River Valley that's separate from the church that we have from the Hudson River Valley, which is also separate from the rhyolites that we have from northern New Hampshire. So people bringing their own stone tool material from other areas to meet up here, potentially leading to trading of that material, probably a pretty important social gathering. This isn't going to happen all the time. These areas of aggregation or big social gatherings are probably really important events for people to see each other. They haven't seen each other for a year, maybe a couple of years. It's hard to know from the archaeological record. But, these types of large aggregation areas or social gatherings are good times to engage in trade for raw materials from across the region. Children get to play together who haven't seen each other for, a year, 2 years. Think of maybe when you were younger, meeting up with your cousins if they lived in another state. Similar things are going to be happening here. A good opportunity for people to find, a husband or a wife, marriages, family reunions for those family members that have been separated from previous marriages, if they're in different family groups that go their separate ways after these events. These would be times of really important social gatherings too. So, these are all sort of based on suppositions, based on the archaeological material. But I think that what we're seeing at the Brian Jones site, particularly when you compare it with some of the other Paleo-Indian complex sites along the Farmington River, is a potentially really important area where these types of daily activities might have occurred. There are many, many people and organizations to thank for this work that we did, not least of all Brian Jones in the Office of State Archaeology, all of our crew and everyone at Archaeological and Historical Services, the company that I work for, Mark Banks, who also worked with us at the site, the Connecticut Department of Transportation, first and foremost, for providing not only the time to excavate the site, but the money and support that we needed to do so. The collaborative relationship that we have with the Yukon Geosciences, the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office has also provided innumerable support for this project. Rotha Construction, the construction company that built this excellent bridge that is now up in Avon that anyone can go see today, and of course the town of Avon. And then finally, I'd like to thank the Farmington River Watershed Association for inviting me to speak about this site, and thank you.
For those of you who are interested in learning more about this topic, the Avon Historical Society, in conjunction with the town of Avon, will be hosting informational sessions over the next year, so keep an eye out for those. Thank you, Dr. Leslie, for this enlightening presentation, and as a token of our thanks, we would like to present you with an honorary membership to this organization. You'll be receiving the official certificate in the near future. And speaking of membership, for those of you who are already members, we thank you for your support and ask that you take a few moments to go onto our website and renew your membership. And for those of you who are new to the organization or who joined this meeting to learn more about the river and the FRWA, we are pleased to share with you our enthusiasm for this precious and beautiful natural resource. And we invite you to join the FRWA, along with hundreds of other residents of the Farmington Valley who are already members. So I hope that before the night is through, you will take an opportunity to go onto our website and renew your membership or become a new member. That brings us to the business portion of our meeting, which will consist of an annual report presented by our Vice President, John Lodati, a financial report presented by our Treasurer, Brian Freeman, and the election of directors to be presided over our Vice President, Carol Noble. And I can assure you that under Carol's guidance, this election will not be rigged. John.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for attending our first virtual annual FRWA meeting. My name is John Lodati, and we're here at Manitouk Camp in Granby, Connecticut. Behind me is beautiful Manitouk Lake, where I live. Manitouk Lake is within the Salmon Brook watershed, which of course is within the Farmington River watershed. It provides critical habitat for wildlife. Just to our east are some vernal pools that support biodiversity. 200 yards to our south is a biodiversity data site which contains endangered species. The lake is protected by the Friends of Manitouk Lake, which relies for advice and counsel on FRWA for invasive species control, both on the shoreline and within the lake itself. The highlights from fiscal year 2020 are many. For starters, FRWA received a major gift from the estate of Mrs. Lily Fry of beautiful riverside land in New Hartford, as well as a $150,000 endowment to help fund its conservation. This generous donation by Mrs. Fry will give FRWA an amazing location right on the Farmington River for hands-on watershed education and conservation activities. FRWA fought for years in court to protect Mrs. Fry's charitable intent, and so the final conveyance of this land in late 2019 was a tremendous moment for our organization. FRWA's fiscal year 20 work helped make important on-the-ground progress in parts of the watershed that are oftentimes overlooked. After several years of effort and close work with community stakeholders, FRWA brought a plan for the Pequabic River watershed to completion in 2019, in September of 2019 to be exact. This plan will help attract federal funds for a community-driven stormwater pollution project in what has been one of the more impaired urbanized areas of our beautiful watershed. FRWA built off of that work and strategic focus on the Bristol area by completing a major rain garden installation in Page Park and helping the Pequabic River Watershed Association with the completion of another rain garden at the Bristol Eastern High School. Work in this vein continued when FRWA won a major grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to conduct focused stormwater pollution education and outreach, including another rain garden in the Bristol area. This rain garden was completed in September of 2020 at Rockwell Park, and its location will be the site of future outreach and education opportunities for City of Bristol citizens and their visitors. Existing grants from the National Park Foundation enabled FRWA to take advantage of the 2020 winter season to develop concrete plans for a new community rain garden in Winstead and a woodland garden in Barkhamsted. Sited in key public locations like parks and community spaces, these rain gardens will serve as high-impact teaching tools about stormwater pollution issues, as well as other wonderful quality of life benefits to local residents. The crucial work of protecting the Farmington River watershed also remained a top priority, with FRWA engaging in water quality research and vigorous advocacy on behalf of our beloved river. FRWA's water quality monitoring program continued its high performance, wrapping up a 3-zone sampling season in late 2019 and winning a second Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection grant to sample the river's pristine headwaters, and then pushing through unprecedented pandemic disruption to resume sampling in July of 2020 with the invaluable new laboratory help of the USGS New England Water Science Center, its Connecticut office. On the advocacy front, FRWA weighed in at the state level with a focus on phasing out PFAS, forever chemical firefighting foam, which contaminated the Farmington River during 2 different Bradley Airport spills last year, and at the local level through active participation and written comments in numerous land use proceedings throughout the Farmington Valley. FRWA was also honored to be appointed to the Rivers Sub-Working Group of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, helping draft and develop recommendations on new land use protections and climate resilience measures for Connecticut's precious rivers and lakes. Finally, FRWA worked hard with its community partners to finalize the establishment of the new Federal Wild and Scenic Committee for the Lower Farmington and Salmon Brook. FRWA's years of wild and scenic advocacy have now come to fruition with over 60 miles of river federally protected as free-flowing, and that's for generations to come. Less visible highlights in fiscal year 20 are also worth mentioning. FRWA's year-end fundraising drive in 2019 resulted in one of the largest charitable results for the organization in many years. $36,000 raised by our amazing individual supporters unlocked a matching gift of $20,000. FRWA also increased its membership in fiscal year 20, led another successful annual river cleanup, and closed the fiscal year on strong financial footing, even with the many challenges to normal operations that were imposed on it by COVID-19. Finally, I'd like to stress the importance of planned giving to the Farmington River Watershed Association. Gifts like that from Mrs. Fry will critically support us in our efforts to protect and preserve this beautiful watershed. Thank you for listening, And now let's get on to our treasurer's report.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being part of this special evening and for your support of the Farmington River Watershed Association. My name is Brian Freeman, and it's been an honor to serve on the Farmington River Watershed Association Board of Directors for over 3 years. I've served as the secretary, and I now am serving as the treasurer. I'm joined today with my trusty hiking partner Jess on our favorite section of the Farmington River, Fisher Fields in Avon. I'm sure that it's no surprise to anyone on this call that 2020 has been a year like no other for charities, nonprofits, not-for-profits, and other important organizations which rely on memberships and donor contributions. The FRWA is no different. In years past, the FRWA functioned with an operating deficit. We have been working diligently to minimize that gap and reduce the deficit without jeopardizing the important programs, services, and water testing that our amazing staff performs. We've been very successful in closing this gap, and we're happy to say that we are operating in the black for the 2020-2021 budget year. We are very fortunate that the Watershed Association has an endowment fund, and that has been built up over many years. The money in that fund is carefully invested. The long-term hope for the FRWA is that we will continue to build this endowment fund through membership, as well as generous contributions and donations from people just like you. With this support, we can grow and expand the educational programs, testing, and environmental awareness that we provide. For some raw numbers, the value of our endowment funds at the end of quarter 2, 2019 was $894,000. At the end of quarter 2, 2020, the total value of funds was just over $1.1 million, which includes a very generous contribution from the FRWA estate. From a financial perspective, the board's focus is to preserve and responsibly manage the endowment for the future. As you can all imagine, the FRWA was elated when we became the owners of the piece of property from the FRWA estate. As this is a new adventure for us, we are just beginning to learn what this will mean in terms of operating expenses to maintain the property. But imagine the opportunity we have with that property to be able to offer educational programs to area children who may not even realize their reliance on the Farmington River. I'm sure there will be more to come with updates and information about the possibilities in 2021. Again, I want to thank you for being here tonight and for supporting the Farmington River Watershed Association. And now I'd like to introduce you to Carol Noble, Vice President of the Farmington River Watershed Association Board of Directors.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks to all of you for tuning in to the first virtual Farmington River Watershed Association annual meeting. I'm reporting from the newest Farmington Watershed Association sponsored rain garden located here in Rockville Park, Bristol, alongside a beautiful section of the Pequabic River. With the help of our program grants and many community volunteers, Farmington River Watershed Association staff has created or contributed to this and other community rain gardens within the past year. These gardens capture runoff from roofs and pavement for pollutant removal and beneficial use of stormwater. Since stormwater pollution is the #1 water quality problem of the Farmington watershed, these prototype projects bring the community together to share and learn and result in a beautiful way to improve the health and resiliency of the watershed. I urge you to check the Farmington River Watershed Association website for more information and to take the River Smart Pledge. Each action may seem small, but collectively we make a difference to keep the watershed healthy. Before introducing the directors you recently elected and re-elected, I'd like to give you an update on the board leadership program of this past year. Through Hartford Foundation's nonprofit support program, Farmington River Watershed Association staff and directors had the opportunity to participate in a series of best practices workshops with the goal of taking the board governance to a new level of excellence. As a follow-up to the workshops, Farmington River Watershed Association obtained a grant to engage a consultant, Sherry Adams, to conduct a board assessment and facilitate a board retreat. In lieu of the retreat, which was canceled because of COVID, a fund development action plan was created. The work products have been eye-opening and helpful in outlining a plan for strengthening board support of the agency. Our newly elected and re-elected directors are Robin Barron, Guy West, Chip Harrison, Deborah Leonard, Vic Schoen, John Robinson, and John Ladowdy, Vice President. These folks share a commitment to the Farmington River Watershed Association mission for a healthy watershed through our actions. They're also ambassadors, so even though we aren't able to meet today in person and shake hands or share a story or discussion, we hope you'll take an opportunity over the upcoming days and months to keep in touch. We welcome the ideas and friendships that are developed through this river organization. Thank you to all the Farmington River Watershed Association directors, past and present, for the amazing work that has been accomplished and for the vision to protect this splendid resource. Now, back to you, Michael.
Thank you, John, Brian, and Carol, and thank you for the board members who have volunteered their time and energy to this organization and for standing for election. If other people out there are interested, we're always looking for people to serve on the board or on committees or to otherwise volunteer, so please be sure to let us know of your interest. Let me also remind everyone that we are having the Wild and Scenic Film Festival on November 19th. It was a big hit last year, and we expect that under the expert preparation of Laura Hart, our Conservation Projects Director, this will be an exciting and entertaining event. So we hope that you will log into that virtual film festival as well. That is it for tonight, and thank you for all being here. What I would normally say is drive home safely. But since you are all sitting on your couches at home, I guess I'll simply say, get out of your couch safely. Thank you and good night.